The night the thermometer outside Nora Strand's window dropped to 58 below zero, every house in Grayridge, Alaska lost heat except one. A small, oddly shaped structure at the edge of town with walls so thick the windows looked like tunnels, built by a woman the entire community had spent 8 months calling wasteful, paranoid, and frankly ridiculous. Because long before that Arctic blast descended from the north slope with wind cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes, Nora had tried to tell them what was coming, and they had laughed at every word. It started in early spring when Nora purchased the last undeveloped lot in Grayridge, a flat acre wedge between the airstrip and the tree line, where permafrost made conventional building nearly impossible. Most people assumed she'd put up a standard prefab like everyone else, something practical that could be heated with diesel and repaired with parts flown in from Fairbanks. Instead, Nora hired a botanist from Anchorage and spent 3 weeks harvesting live sphagnum moss from the wetlands south of town, packing it into wooden frames she built herself, and stacking those frames into walls nearly 3 feet thick. The comments started immediately at the trading post where Ruth Keller stood behind the counter, watching Nora load moss bales into her truck bed. "You planning to grow a house or build one?" Ruth asked, drawing chuckles from the men drinking coffee near the wood stove. Nora didn't smile. "Moss holds more insulation value per inch than anything you can buy," she said evenly, "and it regulates moisture naturally." Ruth exchanged glances with the others. "Honey, we've been heating homes up here for generations. You're spending a fortune on something that's just going to rot." But Nora kept working. She constructed a timber frame using local spruce, then filled the walls with layers of living moss compressed between vapor barriers and reinforced with wire mesh. The structure rose slowly, its walls bulging outward in thick curves that made it look less like a cabin and more like something organic, something grown rather than built. The windows set deep within the mass, small openings that tunneled through 3 feet of insulation before reaching glass. The roof sloped gently beneath additional moss layers sealed under protective membranes. By midsummer, the mockery had spread throughout Grayridge. At the Airstrip Cafe, bush pilots joked about the Moss Monster house. Teenagers drove past taking photos for social media, captioning them with phrases like, "When you take eco-living too far," and "Alaska's ugliest building." Even the mayor mentioned it during a town meeting, suggesting politely that Nora might want to consider architectural standards that reflect community values. Nora's only friend in town was an elderly Inupiaq man named Samuel, who sometimes sat on a folding chair watching her work. One afternoon he ran his hand along the moss wall and nodded slowly. "My grandmother built something like this once," he said quietly. "Long time ago, before oil money changed everything. She said the old knowledge kept people alive when new systems failed." Nora looked at him, grateful someone finally understood. "That's exactly what I'm trying to do." But understanding didn't spread beyond Samuel. When Nora installed her heating system, a small masonry heater that burned wood with extreme efficiency, people shook their heads again. "You'll freeze when your wood runs out," someone told her at the grocery store. "Diesel's reliable. Moss walls and a glorified fireplace? That's just stubbornness." Nora bought the wood anyway, stacking cords of it under a covered shelter beside her strange, thick-walled hut. By October, as temperatures began their long descent toward winter darkness, Nora moved into the completed structure. Inside, the space felt different from any building she'd ever inhabited. The air remained still, quiet, almost hushed. The thick moss walls absorbed sound and held temperature with eerie steadiness. Even with minimal heat from the masonry stove, the interior stayed comfortable while outside temperatures dropped into the teens, then the single digits, then below zero. She monitored everything carefully, tracking indoor temperature, humidity levels, heat retention. The data confirmed what she'd known theoretically, but now felt practically. The moss walls were performing beyond even her expectations, storing warmth during the day, releasing it slowly at night, maintaining stability that conventional insulation couldn't match. Meanwhile, across town, neighbors cranked their diesel heaters higher as fuel trucks made their regular deliveries and thermostats climbed towards settings that made monthly bills painful. Then in late November, the forecast changed. A massive high-pressure system was building over the Arctic Ocean, and meteorologists used words like historic and dangerous to describe what might happen when it pushed south. Nora studied the models on her laptop, watching the pressure gradient tighten, seeing temperatures predicted to fall lower than anything Grayridge had experienced in 30 years. She added extra wood to her stacks, checked her stove seals, and tested her backup systems. At the trading post, Ruth mentioned the forecast casually. "Going to be a cold one," she said. "Probably hit 40 below." Nora looked up from the supplies she was purchasing. "The models are showing worse than that. Much worse." Ruth laughed. "Weather service always overpredicts. We'll be fine. We've got heat, generators, the whole town set up for winter." Nora didn't argue. She just carried her supplies to the truck, drove back to her moss-walled hut, and began preparing for something she suspected the rest of Grayridge wasn't taking seriously enough. Because she'd learned something during her months of research and building, something the community hadn't wanted to hear. That comfort-bred complacency and modern systems only worked until they didn't. The cold arrived on a Thursday afternoon without warning, without the usual gradual descent that gave people time to adjust. 1 hour the temperature sat at 20 below, uncomfortable but manageable. The next hour it had dropped to 40 below and was still falling. By evening, when darkness settled over Grayridge like a physical weight, the thermometer outside the airstrip office read 53 below zero, and the wind had begun. Inside her moss-walled hut, Nora barely noticed the change at first. She was reading beside the masonry heater, its small fire burning steadily, when she glanced at her indoor thermometer out of habit. 68 degrees. The same as it had been that morning. She walked to the window, peered through the deep tunnel of moss insulation, and saw her outdoor thermometer illuminated by the porch light. 56 below. She pressed her hand against the interior wall. It felt cool, but not cold. The moss layers doing exactly what she designed them to do, creating such resistance to heat transfer that the brutal temperature outside couldn't penetrate inward. She added 2 logs to the heater, not because she needed them yet, but because maintaining the thermal mass mattered. Then she made tea and returned to her book while outside the wind began to scream. Across town, the crisis was already unfolding. Diesel fuel, which gelled at extreme temperatures despite additives, began thickening in outdoor tanks and fuel lines. Furnaces struggled, working harder to produce less heat. Thermostats climbed while indoor temperatures dropped. People turned up their systems, demanding more from equipment that was already straining, and one by one, things began to fail. The Henderson's furnace quit first, its fuel line completely gelled. Tom Henderson spent an hour trying to restart it before admitting defeat and calling neighbors for help. But the neighbors were dealing with their own problems. The Pratts had heat, but were burning through fuel so fast they worried about running out before a delivery truck could get through. The Millers were running space heaters off their generator, which was consuming diesel almost as quickly as they could pour it. By midnight, the temperature had reached 58 below zero, and the wind had increased to sustained speeds above 40 miles per hour, creating wind chills that made the outside air instantly lethal. Emergency services put out warnings telling people not to travel, not to go outside, to shelter in place. But sheltering in place only worked if your shelter held heat. Ruth Keller sat in her living room wearing 3 layers of clothing, watching her breath form small clouds in the air. Her furnace was still running, but the house was losing heat faster than the system could replace it. She'd sealed the doorways with blankets, confined herself to one room, and was burning candles for additional warmth. The indoor temperature had dropped to 47 degrees and was still falling. She thought about Nora's moss-walled hut, about the thickness everyone had mocked, about the strange design that had seemed so excessive and unnecessary. And for the first time, Ruth wondered if excessive might have been exactly right. At 2 a.m., Tom Henderson made a decision. His house had dropped to 39 degrees inside, and his children were shivering despite being wrapped in every blanket they owned. His truck would barely start in the extreme cold, but he got it running and drove slowly through empty streets toward the edge of town, toward the one structure that looked different from all the others. When he knocked on Nora's door, she opened it immediately. Warm air spilled out into the deadly night. Tom stood there, shame and desperation mixed on his frozen face. "My furnace is gone," he said. "Kids are freezing. I didn't know where else to go." Nora stepped aside without hesitation. "Bring them in. All of you." 20 minutes later, the Henderson family sat inside the moss-walled hut, slowly thawing, staring around at a space that felt impossibly warm and stable. The children, pressed close to the masonry heater while Tom looked at Nora with something like wonder. "How is it this warm in here?" he asked. "You've got one small fire going." Nora gestured at the thick walls. "The moss doesn't just insulate. It holds heat. The whole structure is acting like a thermal battery, storing warmth and releasing it slowly. And because the walls are so thick, the cold outside can't conduct inward fast enough to matter." Tom ran his hand along the interior wall, feeling the slight coolness that never deepened into cold. "Everyone said you were crazy building this thick." "Everyone was wrong," Nora said quietly. By dawn, 3 more families had arrived. Ruth Keller came just before sunrise, her truck nearly out of fuel, her hands shaking from cold despite heavy gloves. She didn't make excuses or apologies. She just looked at Nora and said, "I was wrong. About everything." Nora made space for her near the heater. The small hut filled beyond what seemed possible, but the thick moss walls held steady. Nora rationed the firewood carefully, explaining how the masonry heater's efficiency meant they needed far less fuel than conventional heating. She organized sleeping shifts, shared her food supplies, and maintained calm while outside the temperature held at deadly levels and the wind continued its relentless assault. Samuel arrived mid-morning, walking slowly through the brutal cold. When Nora opened the door, he smiled faintly. "Told you the old knowledge worked," he said. Inside, surrounded by the people who had mocked her for months, Nora tended the fire and monitored the temperatures and kept everyone safe within walls that refused to surrender heat. And when Tom Henderson asked how long they could survive like this, Nora checked her wood supply and her food stores and said calmly, "Longer than the cold will last." The Arctic blast held Grayridge in its grip for 4 days. For days when the temperature never rose above 50 below, when the wind never stopped screaming, when simply opening a door meant risking frostbite in seconds. And for 4 days, Nora's moss-walled hut remained the warmest, safest structure in town, while conventional homes hemorrhaged heat and fuel supplies dwindled and families huddled together waiting for the cold to break. Inside the hut, life fell into careful rhythms. Nora woke before dawn each morning to tend the masonry heater, adding wood precisely, maintaining the low, steady burn that kept the structure's thermal mass charged. She tracked indoor temperature religiously. 65 degrees. 66. Never below 64, even when the outside thermometer read its lowest point of 61 below zero. The children played quiet games near the heater. Adults took turns sleeping on the cushions and bedding Nora arranged throughout the small space. Ruth helped organize meal preparation using Nora's camp stove and stored supplies. Samuel told old stories about winters past, about survival techniques his grandparents had known, about the importance of building with the land instead of against it. And slowly, in the forced intimacy of shared survival, something shifted. Tom Henderson apologized first, on the second evening, speaking quietly while others slept. "I laughed at your walls," he admitted. "Told people you were wasting money on something that would never work." Nora added a log to the heater before responding. "You were trusting what you'd always known. That's not unreasonable." Tom shook his head. "But you were looking ahead, preparing for something worse than what we'd seen before. That took courage." The wind rattled the small windows, but the sound felt distant, almost abstract, filtered through 3 feet of moss that absorbed vibration along with cold. Ruth spoke from her sleeping spot near the wall. "I think we trusted our systems too much," she said. "Believed diesel and furnaces and the way we've always done things would be enough no matter what." Nora sat back, watching firelight play across the moss-insulated walls. "Modern systems work until they don't. That's not paranoia. It's just reality." On the morning of the 5th day, the temperature finally began to rise. Not quickly, but noticeably. 54 below. Then 50. By afternoon it had climbed to 43 below, and the wind had diminished to something almost normal. Emergency services began moving through town, checking on residents, delivering fuel, assessing damage. They found frozen pipes, damaged furnaces, depleted fuel tanks, and families exhausted from fighting the cold in homes that weren't built for such extremes. And they found Nora's hut, strange and thick-walled at the edge of town, where 9 people had weathered the worst Arctic blast in decades without crisis, without fear, without ever dropping below comfortable temperature. The fire chief stood inside for several minutes, just looking around, running his hand along the moss walls. "This shouldn't work," he said finally. "Everything I know about building says this is too unconventional, too experimental." Nora checked the heater one last time. "Conventional wisdom works until conditions exceed its design parameters," she said. "I built for the worst case, not the average one." The fire chief nodded slowly. "Smart. Real smart." As families returned to their homes to begin repairs, the conversation in Grayridge changed fundamentally. At the Airstrip Cafe, people talked about insulation depth, thermal mass, backup heating systems. Building supply companies in Fairbanks started receiving calls about moss harvesting and alternative wall construction. The mayor quietly asked Nora if she'd be willing to present her design to the town council. Ruth reopened the trading post once power was restored, and the first thing she did was order books on natural insulation and traditional building methods. When Nora came in for supplies, Ruth rang up her order then said, "I'm sorry for not listening, for making you a joke." Nora accepted the apology with a slight nod. "You're listening now. That matters more." By spring, 3 new homes in Grayridge were under construction using modified versions of Nora's design. Thick walls, moss insulation, masonry heaters. Builders from other villages flew in to study the techniques. Samuel spent his afternoons teaching traditional knowledge to younger people who suddenly wanted to learn. And Nora's hut, once mocked as the Moss Monster House, became something else entirely. Proof that old wisdom adapted to new challenges could outperform modern convenience when conditions turned extreme. One evening in June, after the snow had melted and the sun hung low in the endless Arctic twilight, Tom Henderson stopped by with his children. They brought fresh-caught salmon and vegetables from the greenhouse. "Wanted to say thank you," Tom said. "Properly. For saving us when we'd spent months telling you that you were wrong." Nora invited them in, and they sat together eating dinner while the children examined the moss walls with new appreciation. "Were you scared?" Tom's daughter asked. "When everyone was losing heat, and you were the only one who wasn't?" Nora considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally, "because I'd done the math. I tested the systems. I knew the walls would hold." Tom looked at her across the table. "What made you so sure something this bad was coming?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure. But I knew it was possible, and possible was enough. Because the cost of being wrong about preparing was just money and effort. The cost of being wrong about not preparing was lives." After they left, Nora stood outside her thick-walled hut in the pale midnight sun, looking out at the landscape that had tried to kill them all just months earlier. The moss in her walls was still living, still growing slowly within its sealed environment, still providing insulation that no manufactured product could match. She built something that worked with the land instead of fighting it, something that held warmth through the darkest cold, something that had proven itself when it mattered most. Inside, the masonry heater sat cold now, unneeded in summer's mild temperatures. But come winter, it would burn again, steady and efficient, warming walls that would hold that warmth through any storm. And this time, when the cold came, Grayridge would be ready. Because sometimes the only way to change minds isn't through argument or explanation. It's through survival. Through being the one place that stays warm when everything else goes cold. Through building something so thick and so strange that people laugh until the day they need it. And then they never laugh again.